This is bias binding, and there are two ways that you can use it. Use it to cover the raw edge of your fabric, or as a facing. Here's how you sew it to cover the raw edge of your fabric. Start off with your fabric and the raw edge. Get the bias binding and open it up. With right sides together, pin your bias binding to your fabric, aligning the raw edges. Now over to your sewing machine. With a straight stitch, stitch in the 1/4 fold of your bias binding. To enclose the raw edge of your fabric, flip the bias binding over to the wrong side of your fabric, back over to the sewing machine and top stitch the bias binding closed. You can see how bias binding adds a colourful yet practical addition to your sewing projects. And here's how you sew it as a facing. Here's how. Get your fabric and your bias binding. Open up the bias binding and pin it right sides together to your fabric's raw edge. Sew with a straight stitch down the 1/4 fold crease in your bias binding. With your bias binding now sewn to your fabric, fold your bias binding to one side and edge stitch it down. Make sure to sew right at the edge and catch the seam allowance from the previous step while edge stitching. This step prevents your facing from peeking out of your garment and rolling up. Now that you have sewn an edge stitch, flip your bias binding to the wrong side of your fabric and pin it flat. Back over to your sewing machine and top stitch on the fold of your bias binding. This is how you sew bias binding as a facing, without any visible stitches or pattern pieces. If you enjoyed this sewing tutorial, make sure to hit like, save and follow for more sewing tips and tricks.